Morning, all. All right, so we're going to take a look now at the 1928-1929 season, a season which did not see very many goals. So, goal scoring had been down, but it reaches historic lows in 1928-29 to the point where all 10 teams on the board had less than 1.5 goals scored per game. So, you're looking at less than 3 goals in total per game and well under the Chicago Blackhawks had 33 goals in 44 games. It was a rough season if you were a fan of the Chicago Blackhawks in 1928-29. The Montreal Canadiens finished the season 22-7-15, so that's 15 ties in 44 games. 59 points for them. The New York Americans surprised many by finishing second, 19-13-12 record, 50 points for them. The Toronto Maple Leafs they get up to third in the division that year, 21-18-5 with 47 points overall. The Ottawa Senators continue to have their struggles, 14-17-13, 41 points. The Montreal Maroons at the bottom of the division, 15-20-9, 39 points. In the American division, Boston's number one, 26-13-5 record, 57 points for them. The New York Rangers 21-13-10 for 52 points. The Detroit still Cougars 19-16-9 with 47 points. And playing now out of the Olympia, which is a 15,000 seat arena. The Pittsburgh Pirates, rough year, 9-27-8 for 26 points. And the Chicago Blackhawks, who played some of their games out of Chicago Stadium, which seated 16,000 people. They finished the season 7-29-8. 22 points for the Chicago Blackhawks. They had almost as many points as they had goals, since they only had 33 that year in the goals department. George Hainsworth, who is, again, your Vezina Trophy winner, he had an NHL record 22 shutouts that season. Remember, it's only a 44-game schedule, so that means once every other game he had a shutout. He was disappointed if he allowed a goal, I guess. And this is a record that nobody's ever going to threaten. It's never going to happen. I just don't see it. No matter how much defense and trapping hockey we see in the National Hockey League, I don't think a goaltender will ever get near 20 shutouts in a season, much less 22. The playoffs change. It becomes crossover. So instead of having the divisional matchups where you would have the Americans against Toronto and the winner playing Montreal, they just said, no, we're going to have the Americans or the American and Canadian division swap, basically. You get third place against third place, second place against second place, first place against first place in what was the semifinals, as the first place teams got a bye out of the quarterfinals, and their series was longer than anybody else's. It was best of 5, and the other series were best of 3, which I think is kind of odd. But hey, you're trying to make it so those games between the top teams in each division that they mean something. And probably to get a little bit extra in terms of gate receipts too. Sure, why not? So December 18th of 1928, George Hainsworth sets a record, and we're going to talk a lot about goalie records this season. 5 road shutouts in a row. So that's a lot. And February 28th of 1929, Chicago gets shut out for the 8th straight game. So that had to be tough to watch, right? 8 games in a row they didn't have a goal. So, yeah, scoring was definitely a problem that season, and the NHL got really desperate. In fact, in the last game of the season, they allowed forward passing in every zone. They allowed players to kick the puck, and the longest a goaltender was allowed to hold the puck was 3 seconds. So they were, and it did allow some goals in that game. So the NHL was like, fine, we'll implement some changes next season, which we'll get to when we get into the 1929-30 season. But the NHL realized they had a problem here. You can't have a team getting shut out 8 games in a row. As great as it is for goaltenders, and again, coaches don't care. Coaches do not care about how entertained you are watching a hockey game. It's all about keeping the goal scoring for the other team down. September 22nd of 1928, the NHL turns 10-minute overtime into a full 10 minutes rather than sudden death. Not sure why you do that. You have a league where goals aren't being scored, and you decide, we'll make it so it's a full 10 minutes rather than sudden death. Why? Forward passes into the offensive zone are allowed, but once in the offensive zone, you were not allowed to make forward passes. Again, until the final game of the season where they allowed it just to see what would happen. And turns out goals happen. What a surprise. The NHL this season starts tracking shots stopped as well as save percentage. So this is where we start getting into some more modern stats. Really bare minimum kept for stats up until that point. The Senators are still having problems making ends meet. So Punch Broadbent, who they acquired the year before in that Hooley Smith deal because they had to sell off Hooley Smith, well, now they sell Punch Broadbent to the New York Americans for cash. So they are selling their players for money and doing it because the Ottawa Senators are having a very difficult time making ends meet. We know they're not going to stay there. The current Ottawa Senators, there was a long stretch between the original Ottawa Senators and the current Ottawa Senators franchise being there where Ottawa did not have an NHL team. So the Hawks' leading scorer that season is Vic Ripley. No relation to Rhea. He had 13 points in 44 games. He's their leading scorer. So we talked a lot this past season about Chicago with Connor Bedard and how he could use a little bit more support and all that. 13 points being your leading scorer in a 44-game season. There wasn't anybody there from the looks of it. They only had 7 wins and all that, right? 120 shutouts in the 220 games that were played that season. So if you're watching it, there's a good chance whoever scores first wins the game. And I'm not guessing that the 2-goal lead was the worst lead in hockey. I'm guessing a 2-goal lead was almost a no mercy magnet at that point, if that had been a thing back then. But yeah, 120 total shutouts in 220 games. It was a very low scoring affair every night in the NHL that season. So the Hart Trophy goes to Roy Werders. He is the first goaltender to win the Hart Trophy. He is from the New York Americans. The Vezina goes to George Hainsworth of the Montreal Canadiens. And the Lady Byng for gentlemanly play, Frank Boucher of the New York Rangers wins it yet again. The quarterfinals see Toronto go to Detroit and win 3-1, and then come home and win 4-1. So they win the total goal series 7-2. And then the New York Rangers in another total goal series in the quarterfinal. The semis wasn't total goals. But the New York Rangers and the New York Americans play to a scoreless tie in the first game. And then in the second game, it goes to double overtime before we get a goal. The New York Rangers win that one 1-0 and win the total goal series 1-0. So there were, 8 periods, almost 8 periods of hockey, and you get 1 goal. Yeah, that's the NHL that year. In the semifinal, the Toronto Maple Leafs against the New York Rangers. The Rangers win the first game 1-0. They win the second game in overtime 2-1. So they win that best of 3 series, 2-0. The Boston Bruins. This is one of those rare occasions where the Boston Bruins beat Montreal in the playoffs. They win the first game 1-0. They win the second game 1-0, and they win the third game 3-2, which was considered a barn burner at that point in time. So yeah, Boston sweeps the series against the Montreal Canadiens. Hope they enjoyed that because Boston would go through some real misery against Montreal in the playoffs. In the Stanley Cup final between the New York Rangers and the Boston Bruins. So the first Stanley Cup final between 2 American teams. Boston sweeps the best of 3 affair. 2-0 in the first game and 2-1 in the second game. So Boston wins their first Stanley Cup. That's the Boston Garb. And they're not going to repeat, but Boston, pretty darn good team at that stage. Ace Bailey was the leading scorer in the NHL that year, playing out of Toronto. 44 games, 22 goals, 10 assists, 32 points. Nels Stewart for the Montreal Maroons. 44 games, 21 goals, 8 assists, 29 points. Andy Blair for Toronto. 44 games, 12 goals, 15 assists, 27 points. Carson Cooper for the Detroit Cougars. 44 games, 18 goals, 9 assists, 27 points. Howie Morenz for the Montreal Canadiens, still near the top. 42 games, 17 goals, 10 assists, 27 points. Frank Boucher for the New York Rangers, the very gentlemanly Frank Boucher. 44 games, 10 goals, 16 assists, 26 points. Bill Cook, also of the New York Rangers. 43 games, 15 goals, 8 assists, 23 points. And Harry Oliver, the Boston Bruins, 43 games, 17 goals, 6 assists, 23 points. Then you get into the goaltending stats. And what's interesting is almost every starting goaltender had 10 shutouts or more that season. Tiny Thompson for Boston, 26-13-5 record, 1.15 goals against average, and 12 shutouts. George Hainsworth for Montreal, 22-7-15, so plays every game, just like Tiny Thompson did for Boston. 0.92 goals against for Hainsworth, who had 22 shutouts. John Ross Roach for the New York Rangers, 21-13-10, a 1.41 goals against average and 13 shutouts. Lauren Chabot for Toronto, 20-16-5, 1.52 goals against average, 10 shutouts for him. Dolly Dawson for Detroit, 19-16-9 record, 1.37 goals against average, 10 shutouts. And Roy Werders, who again won the Hart Trophy for the New York Americans, 16-12-10, 1.15 goals against average, 13 shutouts. So, yeah, lots of shutouts that season. And so that's why I've got a couple more goalies on there than I may have had yesterday, and probably going forward through tomorrow and beyond as well. But yeah, this was really a season where goals were hard to come by. Boston ends up winning it in the end. And tomorrow we'll talk about the 1929-1930 season. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.